The following program is a production of Pioneer Public Television.
Hello and welcome to Compass, a new production from Pioneer Public Television. I'm Les Heen, your host for Compass, and this is a weekly discussion of public policy and important issues facing our viewing area. This week, we will discuss what kind of challenges rural emergency response teams are facing when it comes to getting and keeping their volunteers. We'll also touch on what's being done to combat the EMT and EMS shortages across Minnesota with training and education through local awareness and outreach. First, we have the story about a partnership Stevens County Ambulance was created with the University of Minnesota Morris to educate and train pre-med students as volunteer emergency medical technicians for their area. Here is a report from Pioneer's Laura K. Prosser.
With many rural towns struggling to find volunteer EMTs, Stevens County Ambulance is one of the few exceptions. Thanks, in part, to an old partnership with local colleges and high schools in their county.
The partnership actually started back in the 1980s, I think, is probably where you can pinpoint it to, with the University of Minnesota Morris. We had an opportunity to give pre-hospital experience to students that were going to medical school. So it was hands-on, it was patient care experience in the ambulance, and it gave them really an edge up when they went to medical school and started learning the skills that they'd already practiced in the pre-hospital setting. And so we developed the program, the EMT class, and we're also given an opportunity to offer college credits through UMM for the course. So we did that for several years, and then as we developed the education programs further, we also saw an opportunity to provide this training in the high school, and so we partnered with Morris Area High School, the school district.
Through the university and the high school class that we offer, you're looking at 180 to 200 hours worth of classroom time, and then time away from the classroom. The time away from classroom is they can have anywhere from 2 to 3 chapters to read after each night of class. In the classroom, there's lecture. We try to hold the lecture to a couple hours, and so we end up having a couple hours for the hands-on part of it.
Begin by look carefully.
Once we get through, kind of the characteristics of an EMT and the job responsibilities and wellness of the EMT, then we start getting into the anatomy and physiology, and after that, then you start talking about CPR and patient assessment, and that's when the skills start coming in. Throughout the class, there are some quizzes that they have to take, and there are some section tests that they have to take. But then as they get towards the end of the class, then we start prepping them for the National Registry examination process, which is a practical exam and a cognitive exam where they have to do an online exam. And we do that by setting up stations. There's 4 random skills that they have to know, and they have to perform one of those at the National Registry practical exam. So they need to know all 4. So they're practicing them constantly throughout the class.
For Stevens County EMS, it's not just about the retention or shortage of volunteers. It's about addressing a bigger issue, the issue of spreading EMS awareness and education.
Retention for us here at Stevens County Ambulance Service, out of the university program, out of a class of maybe 15 to 20 students, we'll probably get 3 to 5, 6 of them apply to work here on the ambulance service.
And so when you start fostering that interest in pre-hospital care or just the medical field in general, when these kids are young, then they might go off to medical school or go live in the big city for a little while, but then they might reach back and say, you know what, that made a lot of sense. I'm going to move back to the rural area, or perhaps I'm going to stay in the rural area and continue my education. And when we can deliver programs remotely out here in the rural areas, it makes that prospect a little bit more likely. When you look at recruitment and retention, and really just the shortage of qualified personnel in the rural areas, you have to look at the way that you've traditionally done things, and you got to say, okay, how do we do it differently? How do we expose people to all of the opportunities that are out there through the opportunity that we have to educate people and work with people in our EMS education programs?
And that's one of the biggest reasons I think we started the high school programs, is to help people become more aware, or these kids to become more aware, that there's a whole array of different jobs that they can have. I had one guy that worked here on the ambulance service that went through our EMT program. He said when he went to med school, he said, I got into classroom and we started talking about blood pressures, cuffs, and stethoscopes, and half the class didn't even know what they were. And he says, I knew what they were, I knew what they could tell me, what was wrong with my patient, and how to use the thing. So he said, I felt like the medical school was a whole lot easier for him just because of the experience he's had here. And so I think why the university really likes to partner with us is that they have 60 to 80% somewhere of retention, where they've gone on to become paramedics, flight medics, LPNs, RNs, X-ray technicians, doctors.
When it comes to the Stevens County Ambulance Program, it's all about teaching a service. Initially, teaching a service for retention or recruitment, but the service has turned into a more regional application of teaching communities to save lives.
Even if we don't recruit an EMT from one of our classes, maybe we recruited somebody, or trained somebody rather, that's going to go on and work as an accountant or a lawyer or in a trade profession, that now has learned the skills and gained the confidence to respond to an emergency. And even through that, maybe they can save a life or have an impact on somebody's life because they had the confidence to grab that AED off the wall or start CPR, or even the ability to interact with somebody and do a patient assessment or talk with somebody to figure out what's bothering them, right? Because that's what we do as EMTs and paramedics. We can transfer some of those skills and teach people some of those skills and give them the confidence to use those skills and interact with people. Maybe that's part of why we're here as well. And maybe through that we can start to address this issue of shortage of EMTs and paramedics in our rural areas.
With us now to talk about building quality local teams and improving their volunteer base is Randy Fisher of Ringdahl EMS. And that's a collaboration of 4 advanced services and groups in Minnesota and North Dakota. And we also have with us Dan Speaker from the Raymond Ambulance. So, gentlemen, thanks for being with us. Randy, I'd like to start with you. Tell us a little bit about your area, because we have viewers scattered over such a wide area. Tell us a little more specifically what area you serve.
Sure. Ringdahl, as my position with Ringdahl EMS, we have operations in both North Dakota and Minnesota. In North Dakota, it's Jamestown, Castleton, and Lisbon. And also in Minnesota, we have Fergus Falls and Pelican Rapids. And then I also oversee and operate Stevens County Ambulance in Morris, Minnesota.
So quite a large area. Yeah.
We have a lot of volunteer rural services, every one of ours.
Yeah. Okay. And Dan, in your case, Dan Speaker, Raymond, just south of Willmar, Minnesota. You've got the community of Raymond and surrounding townships, and that right there.
Yeah, we cover Raymond and part of the rural areas of Pennock, Blomkist, Princeburg. We also cover Clare City Ambulance if they're out on a call, and we're actually the backup service for Willmar Ambulance if they're all 4 of theirs are out.
Sure.
We've actually got over to Maynard too for some calls.
Okay, so quite a large area. Then people aren't familiar from Willmar to Maynard. That's about almost 30 miles there, so it's also fairly.
We're right on the border of Kansas County and Chippewa, so we do a lot with, both counties. Even though we're in Kansas County, we do cover Chippewa
Sure. So what happens is both of you, you're dealing with, heavily rural areas, Wilmer being a, town of 19,000 and Fergus Falls being a good-sized town, but largely, predominantly rural areas. What are the biggest challenges that you face in what you do? And Randy, I'll start with you.
Staffing. Staffing is a critical shortage right now. It's not only in our rural areas in Minnesota, but as we were talking earlier, North Dakota also, and quite frankly, throughout the United States. Finding EMTs and paramedics, sustaining ambulance services in rural communities is a challenge that's been growing for a long time, and we need to address it in some new ways, because people are finding it difficult to volunteer for a local ambulance service. And quite frankly, I'm not sure that is the model that is sustainable, or the model that we as a public demand from our communities, because it's becoming such a organization that needs to be able to respond with high quality, well-trained people on a regular basis, not just on whether or not they're available or not. We require, when 911 is called, that they respond.
Yeah, I know. One of the things that came up a little earlier, Dan, we were talking before, just before the show, just before we started recording here, we were talking about in your case, and you noticed that, in these towns, like the towns you serve, used to be you had a lot more businesses, you had a lot more people working in businesses, and so the environment was different, and that's where a lot of the volunteers used to come from, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of the store owners would be them and somebody they hired, or like a spouse, and a lot of times they would be on, ambulance or fire, and if there's a call, they drop what they were doing and respond. So we've always had a good response, and as businesses seem to disappear from the small towns, you lose a lot of the people who are working in the small towns. So then you've got to try and find a new source of people to help.
Right, and I suppose part of this is also that if you look at new people to help is a critical one, because you may have people who have enjoyed it and it's been a big part of their life serving on an ambulance crew, but a number of them will reach a point where, whether it's patient care or lifting people in an ambulance, they're just not physically capable to do it anymore, even if they want to. And I suppose we're seeing some of that too as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. We have a growing population. We have more volume of runs that typically our services are responding to. We have increased number of hours for training for a volunteer or for a paid personnel, and it requires a lot of your time. When we talk about a full-time position or a full-time volunteering for a volunteer, they're sometimes doing 2,000 to 4,000, maybe 6,000 hours in a year. When you were there, we were talking earlier that you said you were the only one responding in many cases. Now,
2013 is when we had our big shortage.
And somebody's got to cover it, because when that 911 call comes in, somebody's got to respond in our rural areas.
And is that one of the things that you're running across, is that people will sometimes take this for granted? I mean, because of course they rely on emergency services and they assume they're there. So do you think that a lot of the people in the communities you serve actually understand, what's happened with this shortage and how it's gotten worse?
I think some communities, yes, and some communities believe that we still can run it with volunteers, and I'm not confident that that's possible anymore. There's so many demands on families' times, and it's difficult to drop everything that you're doing to go out and respond on a volunteer organization. And it's not just ambulance. It's fire departments that have volunteer fire departments. It's every one of our community service organizations that are seeing declines in volunteers that are volunteering for their organizations. So it's not, I don't think it's just EMS, but it hits EMS in a critical state because of the fact that when we dial 911, we expect and we want somebody to respond, somebody well-trained and somebody capable of taking care of our heart attack or our trauma situation or stroke or whatever the medical emergency is.
Well, and I expect working patterns also change some, because I know, Dan, when we talked about the small town businesses, for example, now in many of these communities, as many of them have sort of transitioned over time to being more like bedroom communities, well, these are people who, they may leave the house at 7, they're back in that town until 7 o'clock at night. So even if some of them wanted to serve, there'd be a big chunk of the time when they wouldn't even be available, right?
Definitely, that's our Castleton is a good example. It's not too
Castleton,
far away
Minnesota.
from Fargo-Moorhead area, and many people move or go to Moorhead or Fargo to work, and we have a struggle with daytime coverage. Some of our services and most of our services have transitioned into a combination of paid and volunteers. That is helping, but you can't sustain that either if you don't have funding or if reimbursement mechanisms don't change to help pay for that part that the volunteers were contributing or have been contributing over the past 40 years while EMS has been growing. If we don't have funds that replace those volunteers that were doing it for free, or literally for free, maybe $1 or $2 an hour, but basically for free, if we don't have some funds that replace that to help sustain it, I'm not sure how we're going to sustain it.
Ours is becoming one of those bedroom communities. As we have a lot of people that are coming in, buying a house, and then renting it out to people. So that I think that's part of the, lack of a better word, problem is people are coming in renting. They're not putting down their roots, so they don't really want to, volunteer for something like that. And they're there for 6 months, a couple years, and then they're gone to another community.
Sure. And then when you look at the training, I know earlier you had mentioned that there are some significant training, requirements, and some of those have increased over the years. If someone wants to, get involved as a volunteer, what are we talking about in terms of volunteer hours just involved in training alone? How much time does that take?
Well, when I first got involved in EMS to become an emergency medical technician certified, it took 81 hours. That's what it was back in the days I got started. I've been doing this for 40 years now in EMS, and now the class is about 160 hours minimally to become certified as an emergency medical technician, which is the minimum requirement to work on a licensed ambulance service in the state of Minnesota. There are variances that have been proposed and I believe are in place right now for emergency medical responders, or what used to be termed first responders, that can operate as one of the individuals in that ambulance. So that offers some ability to decrease the amount of training that's required. But quite frankly, it's doubled in the amount of hours, and then it's ongoing sustaining hours to retrain and stay skilled at our profession.
Well, and one of the things that I've picked up from some other volunteers I've talked to over the years is burnout. Because as their numbers, as a group, the number of volunteers they can call on as those numbers have decreased, more has been called upon as them individually in some cases. And so they get to the point where they may have had a commitment for part of the time, but now as that commitment grows, aren't we seeing some people sort of burn out on what this is?
Well, that's basically is what happened to Raymond. I used to be on the city council, and I worked in Wilmer, and we had, I think it was 3 EMTs, and they started complaining that they were doing most of the calls and were starting to get burned out. And at that time, we tried a couple things to get other EMTs or other people to volunteer and take the training to become EMTs, and nothing seemed to be working. And then shortly after that, our city maintenance worker had quit, and so I came up with the idea. I said to the other council member, I said, well, since I got the EMT class, should we see how I do as the city guy? And I had to pass all the requirements for the city, and our current mayor, who was on the council at that time when I started, he said, well, if there's a call, unless it's something necessity, he said, you drop what you're doing and go on the ambulance call. So we've had good support from our council to, can't think of the words I'm thinking of, but, to be able
Continue.
to respond for the ambulance. And since I've got on those 3 people, or since I started working for the city, those 3 people have basically just had the burnout and have quit. So that's taken a lot of the help we've had.
Yeah. And so then what happens then if, because there have been some cases where you've maybe got these 2 and 3 and 4 person crews in rural areas, and suddenly 2 or 3 of them, like if it's a husband and wife team, I know there are those scenarios, and they say, we've been doing this a long time, we just can't do this anymore. If those 2 quit and you got 2 others, and it's not enough for them, not enough time for them to continue, what happens in some of these areas? Are there other examples of that, and then what does the community do?
Well, for us, as I was talking a little bit before, about 2013, I think it was, when we've had basically a lot of people, they either got jobs out of town or they quit, and it ended up being me, and we had a couple calls that were called in as non-emergency calls, and basically I just grabbed a fireman, said drive, and I went out and took care of the non-emergencies, and we had voiced our concerns with our, what do you call that person from the state?
The field rep? Or the
field rep.
Field rep, sure.
And they said that, they understand that we were having problems, and they go, so long as this isn't a continual thing, they'll overlook that. As the requirements back then was you had to have 2 EMTs to transport.
Okay.
And since we were doing it basically with a non-emergency, they let us slide for a little bit. And they informed us of this program they call a hardship variance, which basically lets you, with what was called the first responder, have them drive, and then an EMT would make your service legal. Now I believe the state's reclassified them as emergency medical responders. But we had to get people who were willing to take that, and that was a lot shorter training. I think that was 40 hours.
So a lower level of training and a lower delineation of the title, so to speak. Yeah.
So we got, I think it was about 4 of them to do that. And
so that's one possible solution there, is that you can change some of the training. But I'd like us to also talk a little bit about, before I forget, where we go. Because I know early, we talked about some solutions and the volunteer piece. Well, maybe that's not working so well, but is the paid part sustainable? So, where do we go? And maybe this is too much of a wish list, but where do we go in volunteer service or in emergency services?
Sure.
Where do we go next?
Well, I think the partnerships with the cities, making sure that businesses locally attempt to allow employees to maybe volunteer or to work on ambulance services in our rural areas is very important. Those partnerships need to be nurtured and somehow expanded. Funding is another thing. We need to more adequately fund it so that we can maybe pay better those people to leave their jobs, or pay better those people to be able to volunteer on a longer term basis. And we also have to just continue to grow our own people. You find people in a community that have this interest, have this passion in serving their community in some way, and will take the training. We need to maybe help fund their training. We do that in Ortonville. There's a foundation at the Ortonville Hospital that supports the local people if they want to take an EMT class. Fantastic effort. It brings some people in, but we still have shortages there. And some people finish the class and maybe don't want to volunteer, or can't volunteer, or don't have the time to volunteer. So we still have those challenges. In Morris, for example, we utilize a high school-based program. We've got an 86% retention rate in a program there that the Morris Ambulance Service or Stevens County Ambulance does. They work with the college. There's all kinds of different ways, I think, that we can try and engage local community professionals and people to maybe do this as a side job or a part-time job or community service that they do, but it also still demands well-trained, competent individuals to take care of you when you have a heart attack, or me when I have a car crash, or anyone when they dial 911.
So, we've got a couple minutes left here, but it just strikes me that, when someone's watching this program, and maybe that, as you said, maybe they haven't put down roots, or maybe they didn't know where the problem. But I know some people who may have an interest in this. So if someone wants to become engaged and wants to learn about this, how do they start? How do they start by learning where to go?
From us, they usually get a hold of an EMT. We're out constantly talking to people. Would you want to join or volunteer to help here or there? And one thing that, as I said before, the council has always been very supportive. Our council will pay for the class. They just require that the person stay on for 2 years afterwards.
Okay.
And
I think that, and you're seeing that in a lot of communities, right? That there's that sort of council support because they realize it's important, so they're paying for more training necessarily than they used to, right?
I think so in some cases. I think if there's people out there that are interested in working on an ambulance service, I think the first step would be go contact your local ambulance service. Talk to them about what opportunities are available, where they have the training, how they could get involved in the training, and go out and become trained. Because the first step, regardless of whether or not you're going to volunteer on a local ambulance service or a rescue squad or a first responder team or a fire department, is to obtain the training. And that training isn't just going to benefit your local ambulance service and your fire department. It's going to benefit you as an individual at your place of work, in your community. If you're working with the Boy Scouts or any kind of civic organization, that training, if you stop on the side of a highway to help somebody that's injured, is going to be beneficial. So take the training.
Randy, Dan, thank you both. We're out of time, but appreciate you coming here to talk to us about emergency services.
Thank you. You're welcome.
That's it for this week on Compass. Join us next week as we take a look at the future of higher education as it pertains to liberal arts, private colleges in our viewing area. Thank you.